Hey everyone, welcome to the first of our leadership seminar videos for the month of January. I've got two more videos, so 3 videos in total for you to check out. I don't expect them to be a whole lot of me sitting here talking to you. I'm going to go over some information, go over some content. And then what's going to happen is I'm going to give you some homework. And for 2 of these videos, the homework is kind of going to be a lot. That's not to scare you, but that's to give you a heads up. Like the vast majority of what this seminar is going to bring is going to be what you put into it. The homework you do, the time you put into that homework is where the real value is going to come from in these seminars. And so I want to warn you about that. I want to give you a heads up about that. Don't look at the time of the video and be like, oh, that was only like 5 minutes or whatever. And what am I supposed to get out of that? That's not how this month's seminars are going to work. This is very heavy on what you do with this content. And so I encourage you to right now, right from the start, set aside time to work on this. And whether that's right now when you watch the video or later in the week or maybe next week, I encourage you to set aside 30 minutes, an hour for these activities so that you've got time to think, you've got time to focus, and you've got time to work on it, because the value of it is going to be the work that you do after hearing this content. Okay? So the first session today is about authority and chains. Now, if you've been at AWC for a while, you've probably heard me either preach about this or reference it or talk about it in some way, shape, or form. But I talk about how there are 4 levels of authority in our lives. The first is our personal life, then our family life, then our church life, and then our community. And with those 4 levels of authority, you don't have authority in your community until you have authority in your church. And you don't have authority in your church until you have authority in your family. And you don't have authority in your family until you have authority in your own life. Now, what I mean by authority is that you have freedom, that you have a right to actually determine the direction, and that you are given that right by God, and that God has given you that power and that clarity to be able to say something and have that hold true, or to have that take place, or have that be the guiding principle. You think about when you're driving and you get pulled over by the cops, they have authority to pull you over. They have authority to give you the ticket. Right? It's in their realm of control or power to make those determinations. And so if we want to have authority in our families, we have to have authority in our own lives first. If we want to have authority in our church, we've got to have authority in our families. If we want to have authority in our community to make a difference and to have an impact and actually determine the change, then you have to have authority in your church too. And so there's this level system of first thing you've got to have is you've got to have authority in your personal life. And then you can look at having authority in your church. Then you can have authority in your personal authority, then family, then your church, and then your community. And so really as leaders, we want to have authority on our community, and we want to be able to have an impact, and we want to be able to have a good influence in our church, and we want to be able to lead our families well. And honestly, we really want to be able to have authority in our own lives to make the changes and to grow the way that we should be growing. And so we've got to work through those different levels of authority in order to get to the place where we can really lead. Now, in each of those levels, I believe that there are 4 main roadblocks or chains that keep us from having authority. And Those four things, and I think there's probably more, but I boiled them down to four categories. Basically, we run into lies that we believe, so things that aren't true that we believe or keep going back to. Our past sins that hold us with guilt and shame. The third thing is our present sins, those actions, those attitudes, those things that we have still in our lives that shouldn't be there presently. And then the fourth thing is our fear. And fear usually is about the future, but it's our fears about what is happening or what's going to happen. And those four roadblocks or chains get in the way of us having authority in those different levels. So the lies that I personally believe keep me from having authority in my own life. The past sins of my family keep me from having authority to influence my family well. The sins that our church is currently involved in are things that keep us from having authority in our church, and thus also keep us from having authority moving into our community. And our fears about the world keep us from having authority in our community. And so we've got these different roadblocks, these different chains that bind us, that hold us, that keep us down, that need to be dealt with in the process of gaining authority in these different levels. But you can't, and this is the thing, you can't deal with the roadblocks that are in the community until you've dealt with the things on the other three levels. So you can't look at your community and be like, you know what, the sins of our community are just massive, and I just want to go and I want to deal with those sins, I want to correct them and get us out of that. Well, if you haven't dealt with your baggage and your roadblocks and your chains in the church, you can't deal with the community stuff yet. You don't have authority to do that. You've got to deal with the church stuff first. And if you haven't dealt with your family junk, you can't deal with the junk in the church yet. And if you haven't dealt with your personal stuff, you don't have authority to deal with all your family's issues. And so you've got to work through this process. Now, we can sit and we can look at our community and our church, and we can look at our families, and we can look at our own lives and see some of the different chains that are on there, and we can take inventory of that and see what those different things are. But we can't really deal with them until we've dealt with the first level, and then the second, and the third, and the fourth. So all this really starts with personal stuff. Now, there are some. Let me give you some examples here. Some lies that we deal with might be that you're useless, that your beauty equals your value, or that you can never change. Your past sins may be how you lied to someone, you cheated in a relationship, or maybe you attacked somebody. Your present sins, those things that is still going on in your life, might be you're in a relationship where you're having sex outside of your marriage. Maybe you're self-medicating with illegal drugs or with alcohol, and you're pushing that beyond what's healthy and what's good. Maybe you struggle with this selfishness and greed, and your fears. Some examples of your fears: you may be scared of death. You may be scared that you're going to be forgotten. You may have fear of failure, or you may just have fear of something happening, and you just feel very anxious and worried all the time. And these lies, they leave you walking down a path that's empty, worthless, and going nowhere because it's not real. Lies aren't real. Your past sins keep you from being able to do what God calls you to, because you're always getting into. They're always getting in the way because they're holding you back, either because of your fear or your grudges or your insecurity or your pain or your shame or your guilt. You're scared of what's happening, or you're repeating those actions, whatever it is. Your present sins get in the way because they destroy all the good that God is doing in you, and they destroy all the progress that you're making. Is that as you're going along and growing or trying to grow, your present sins go in and sabotage all that. And your fears, well, they really keep you from taking steps of obedience that you should be taking. They cripple you. And so we've got to deal with these different issues, these lies, these past sins, these present sins, and these fears in these 4 levels in order for you to gain authority personally, in your family, in your church, and in your community. So basically, you deal with those 4 things, and regardless of the level, you deal with those 4 things by doing the opposite. So you deal with the lies by investing in the truth and focusing in on the truth. You deal with your past sins by confession. So past sins are not sins that you're actively engaged in. There's things from your past. You deal with those by confessing them to God, admitting it to yourself, and quite often going to the people that you have affected and confessing it to them. You deal with your present sins through something called repentance, which is the matter of looking at your sin, those things that you're doing now, admitting it, and then turning away from that through the power of Christ, turning away from it and living differently, actually saying, no, I can't have this in my life anymore. I need the change. And moving and investing in getting away from those actions and living differently. And then you deal with your fears through 2 things. You deal with that through faith and worship. And what that is when you worship God, you remember how big He is and how it's not dependent on you. And the more you focus on how big He is and how worthy He is, you realize that it's dependent on Him and not you. And that then helps create something called faith, which is you don't see the future, you don't know exactly how it is, but you trust God to take care of it. And when you trust God to take care of it, good or bad, weird, strange, whatever it is, that puts you in the place where your fears don't have control over you anymore. So you've got to invest in the truth. You've got to focus on the truth. You've got to remember the truth. You've got to confess your sins. You've got to turn from your sins, and you've got to worship with faith. If you do that, then you can start breaking down those chains, getting rid of those roadblocks, and you will find that you have greater authority in your personal life. And once you've done that in your personal life, then you'll start to see that you have authority, growing authority in your family. And then you've got to start working on the roadblocks and the chains in your family. Once you start working through that, you'll find that you have authority in your church. And then you've got to start working through the roadblocks and the chains in your church. And then once you're going through that, then you can have authority in the community. And then you can start working on the roadblocks and chains that are in your community. So, okay, got all that. I know I'm going through this fast, and then there's a pile of stuff here. So what this boils down to is this homework for you, okay? So I know I just threw a bunch of stuff at you. And many of you have heard this stuff already, heard it before, but this is the homework. This is where the real value of this content makes a difference for you. You've got to take some time to map out the chains or roadblocks that you see, that you recognize in each level of your life. Okay, that's part 1. So that means I want you to sit down with a piece of paper and a pen or a document on your computer or whatever works for you. And I want you to list out personal life, family life, church life, community life. And I want you to start at the personal, and I want you to list out what are the lies that I'm believing, what are the past sins that aren't dealt with, what are my present sins that still exist, and what are my fears. All to do with the personal stuff. Once you've gone through that, then I want you to move to your family. And I want you to sit down and think about, okay, in my family life, as a family, what are our lies that we believe? What are our past sins? What are our present sins? And what are our fears? Then once you go through that, then I want you to go to the church and say, as a church, what are our lies that we believe? What are our past sins? What are our present sins? And what are our fears? And then I want you to move to the community. And I want you to say, as a community, what are the lies that we believe? What are our past sins? What are our present sins? And what are our fears? I want you to do that. And that's going to take some time. And I don't want you to just kind of whip it out and just kind of run through it. I want you to take time and really think about it. Right. That's what I'm saying. The more you put into this, the more you're going to get out of this. If you just kind of jot down 2 notes and that's it, that's all you're going to get is 2 notes. This is something that you've got to put the work in for. Once you've done that big list and that inventory, we'll say, once you've done that inventory, I want you to start at the personal level, because you can't work on the other ones until you work on the personal. I want you to go to the personal level. I want you to pick one. Yeah. I mean, you can pick more and you've got to work through all of it, but your homework is to do the inventory and then pick one of the roadblocks, one of the categories, either lies or past sins, present sins, or fears. And I want you to choose what you're going to deal with. Whether it's, I really believe that my value is wrapped up into how effective I am at work. Okay. You've got to deal with your lies. You've got to choose to work on that. Or maybe you're like, I've been holding on to this sin that I did a few years ago and have kept quiet and ashamed and feel guilty about. I need to confess that. I need to confess it to my pastor. I need to confess it to my friend. I got to confess it to my wife. I got to confess it whoever. Decide to do that. Okay, so you pick one thing that you've got to tackle first, and then tackle it. So do the inventory, and then pick one thing, tackle. And if you begin that process and you start to find that God gives you freedom from those chains and those roadblocks, you will find greater and greater authority in your own life. It won't be all these things determining where you're going and how you're living. You will actually find freedom, and you'll actually be able to move in the direction that you choose, that God gives you. And you will have growing authority, and then you will find that you have growing authority in the other levels as well. And so I'm really encouraging you to do the work on this and to invest in this and dig into this, because the more you dig into it, the more you're going to get out of it. All right. So that's our content. That's session 1. That's your homework. Take some time, work on it, and I'll be back with session 2 in a few minutes.